how to value our favorite company. That is what we are going to study today. Whenever we want to buy a second-hand car, what we do is we approach a valuation company, and the company comes alongside us with a checklist and a set of formulas, and they investigate the car in full detail. And once they investigate the car, they have some checklists, a set of criteria which they check, and they have some formula to derive the value of the car at that particular point of time. And once the value is disclosed to the buyer, that is me or somebody else who wants to buy the car, once the value is disclosed, then the buyer is a more comfortable position to decide whether to go ahead with the deal or not to go ahead with the deal. If he's comfortable, then the deal closes and the car is all his. See, in a similar way, is there a method or an approach wherein we can identify or value a company which is publicly listed? So in today's session, we are going to study one of the method, that is the discounted cash flow model, to arrive to the fair price of the company before we have to buy the company. So now, as the name states, discounted cash flow. So this model is used, or the set of steps in this model helps us identify the intrinsic value of the company. And the way of doing it is by identifying the forecasted or the future cash flows of the company and discounting them to the present value. Once the discounting is done to the present value, then we can go ahead and calculate the fair price of the company based on the total shares outstanding of the company. So before we go into the discounted cash flow model, let us understand the significance how this discounted cash flow model arrived to. For that, it is important for us to understand the compound interest formula. If we have to determine what is the value of the capital which we invest today in future, and say suppose we want to invest for about 10 years and the capital amount is about 5,000 rupees, then is there a way where we can determine what will be the value of 5,000 rupees after 10 years at a rate of interest of 6%? For that, we all studied a formula, that is our compounding formula. So I will share the screen which shows us the compounding formula. So this is the compounding formula, compound interest formula. Here, our principal is 5,000. Let me use a highlighter. Which is our favorite highlighter? Let's take blue, green. Let's take green. So P is our principal, which is our 5,000 rupees. And based on the principal, we want to determine what will be the value of 5,000 rupees after 10 years. So 10 years is the time period. T is the time period. And the rate of interest is going to be 6%. That is what we decided. It could be any rate percentage. So in our example, we have picked up 6%. R is 6%. Now, if we plug in all the values in this specific formula, we get to know the value of our invested capital. So that is 8,954. This is already calculated. I've already calculated and kept this result. If you want to, you can open up your calculator and start punching in the values. I will take a little bit time on the slide, a few seconds, and then we can proceed further to identify the basis of how we get the discounted cash flow model. Now, as we know, in discounted cash flow model, we need to identify the future cash flows of the company. That means we assume that we are able to forecast the future cash flows of the company. And if we know the future cash flows of the company, are we able to determine the present value what we need to invest today to derive that future cash flows based on the expected rate of return? So now in that case, let me take another highlighter now. Let me take blue. So what we're saying here is we know the value of A. Let me take red, in fact, inside. So we know the value of A, that is our future cash flow. So now we need to know the value of P. That means our present amount which we need to invest to arrive to the future cash flow. And then we know the value of expected rate of return, what is the return which we are expecting, and what is the duration which we want to invest this capital to arrive to the expected rate of return. So now if we want to know P, we put this entire discount rate. Let me take a pen. This is the discount rate. 1 plus R divided by N raised to the power of time. I put it in a box. So this is the discount rate in the box. This discount rate we move to the denominator. The cash flow becomes our numerator, and then we get the value of P. That is our present value of the future cash flow. So hence comes the next formula. This is what we just saw in the previous slide. So here A is our cash flow. A is our cash flow. And then we have 1 plus R divided by N raised to the power of T. This is our discount which we want to apply on the future cash flow to get to know what is the present value which we need to invest to arrive to the future cash flow at that specific rate of return. Now that we know this, we want to derive the discounted cash flow model based on many years of the company till perpetual, right? So the discounted cash flow model looks like this. This is a replication of the previous formula. So we have the cash flow here for year 1, and then we divide it by our discount rate, which is 1 plus R, which is our rate of return, and 1 here, what you see is a year period. So similarly, we do it for the subsequent year, second year, and then we do it for the third year. We can decide or determine how many years we want to project the cash flow. Typically, we select 5 years, or sometimes it can range up to 10 years as well. After we determine the future cash flows, we also want to know what will be the last cash flow which the company will earn. That is, our last cash flow is our terminal value of the cash flow. So now that we know what are the parameters which we want to determine to identify our fair value of the company using the discounted cash flow model, let us go to a step-by-step approach which we can feed into the formula subsequently. So our first step is to identify the perpetual growth rate of the company. To identify the perpetual growth rate, what we do is we take the growth rate of GDP of the company. Obviously, any company cannot grow beyond the growth rate. So this is a more conservative growth rate which we want to apply to the company. Hence, we take the last 30 years of GDP growth average of India, and then we see the amount comes to about 5.2%. So once we identify this percentage, we look into the annual reports, or we go into nseindia.com and get the shares outstanding of the company. So now that we know our perpetual growth rate and we know our shares outstanding, let us now determine the next step, which is our free cash flow. So how do we determine our free cash flow? I have already shared videos previously. In any case, let us briefly see upon how to calculate the free cash flow. In free cash flow, we take the net cash generated from operating activities from the cash flow statement, and then we subtract with the cost of purchases towards fixed asset, that is property, plant, and equipment. This part of cost towards purchasing of fixed asset is seen under cash flow for investing activities. So now once we know the free cash flow of the company, we go to the next step, which is projected free cash flow. To determine the projected free cash flow, there are two methods. One is we identify the CAGR of the free cash flow itself, and then project the subsequent free cash flow based on the CAGR of the free cash flow. But however, in case of Colgate-Palmolive, the CAGR of free cash flow is a huge number. But however, for all practical purposes, we want to be more conservative in our estimates. Hence, we will choose the net income growth rate. So we will take the historical net profit growth rate. We will determine what is the percentage of growth rate of the net profit, and we will project our net profit growth. Once we project our net profit growth, then we will determine for the historical free cash flows, what is the percentage of the free cash flow with respect to the net profit. We derive that percentage, and then for the projected net profit growth, we multiply the projected value of the net profit with that of the ratio of free cash flow and net profit for the historical values. Once we have done that, once we have projected the free cash flows, we now have our future cash flows of the company. Now that we know our future cash flows, we go to our next step, which is our required growth. So to determine the required growth, here also there are two methods. One approach is directly take the cost of capital, which is 15%, and sometimes some of the investors take as 12%, which is our average return. And then the third method, or the second method in fact, is by using the WACC model. This is a weighted average cost of capital. And this weighted average cost of capital in turn uses capital asset pricing model to determine the required growth rate of the company. Now, investor can decide the model which he wants to use. The WACC model, I will be taking a separate presentation for this. So please subscribe so that you don't miss how to calculate the WACC. Then we have to determine our terminal value. We have seen the final value in the formula, which is the terminal value which we need to determine. So to determine that, we take the last projected free cash flow and then multiply it with the 1 plus perpetual growth rate of the company, which is 5.2. Then we take the required growth rate of the company, which is derived from the step 3. Here we use the cost of capital itself and then subtract it with the perpetual growth rate. This will give us the terminal value of the company. Once we have the terminal value, that is the last projected free cash flow in the formula. Now that we know all of free cash flows for all the years of the company, we need to now determine the present value of those free cash flows. To determine the present value of this free cash flow, we have already seen our inverse formula of compound interest. So we take the free cash flow for each year, we take for year 1, and then we divide it by 1 plus the required growth rate. And then we raise it with the power of the year itself. This we do for every year, for whatever number of years we want to project. And then finally, for the terminal value, we take the discount rate of the last projected year. We sum up all the projected cash flow to get the value today. So this is the intrinsic value of the company today, how much it is worth. So now to determine the fair value of the company, we then take the value which we determine, which is the present value or the intrinsic value, and we divide it by the total number of shares outstanding. This will give us the fair value of the company. So it is investor choice to directly buy based on the fair value, or then could also apply the margin of safety. And the margin of safety is different for different investors depending on the risk appetite. So I typically take the required growth rate or the cost of capital to be the margin of safety. So these are the steps required to identify the fair value of the company by using the DCF method of valuation. So why don't we get into an illustration? Let us see, an illustrated steps to determine the free cash flow. For that, let me open the Excel sheet. Let me stop the share first. And now let me show the Excel. So this is the same Excel which we have used in our previous videos. If you have missed my videos, please have a look. I have demonstrated or illustrated how to determine the profitability ratio of the company by using the profit and loss statement as well as the balance sheet and profit and loss in conjunction to derive the stability ratios as well. And subsequently, I also shared a video how to derive the key ratios by using the cash flow statement of the company. So we have built upon the same Excel sheet. I have added another worksheet here called as the DCF, discounted cash flow model. So now let us, based on the step of step 0 is to identify a perpetual growth rate of the company, which is this one. Let me highlight it in bold. So we need to identify the perpetual growth rate, and then we need to also identify the shares outstanding. Now the perpetual growth rate, as I mentioned, I had taken the values of all the previous years of GDP growth percentage and then arrived to the average value, which is 5.2%. I summed up all the values of GDP growth and subtracted the years to give me the total number of years wherein I have derived the GDP growth. So this gives me 5.2%, and this same value I will populate in the perpetual growth rate, which is 5.2%. So now that we know our perpetual growth rate, let me just increase the font size. I hope it's visible. Okay, now that we identified our perpetual growth rate, how do we identify our shares outstanding? Quickly go into nsc.com or in the annual report and you find our shares outstanding of the company. But in our Excel sheet, we have already populated this value, which is in our summary, which is shown here, number of shares in crores. This is the same value which we look up into our DCF Excel sheet. So I will highlight it in blue, 27.2 crores number of shares. Now that we have done our step 0, let us go into our step one. Our step one is to identify the free cash flow of the company. But before that, we need to represent our discounted cash flow model into an Excel format. So for that, just this table here is a representation of that big, big looking formula for the discounted cash flow. So what we need to do is we need to identify the free cash flow for every year. So I have broken down in the Excel sheet itself each and every year. This is the projected year, which I have put a color. This is the projected year, and this is the actual year. That is our historical years. See the different, yeah. The actual is our historical years for which we already know the cash flow, and now projected value is we need to determine the future cash flows. Let me unhighlight it now. Then once we determine the free cash flow based on the formula, we identify our discount factor. Discount factor is based on 1 plus the required rate of return. Required rate of return we have to calculate raised to the power of infinity. The present value is what we will get by dividing free cash flow by the discounted factor. So this is the representation of the discounted cash flow model. So now let us go to step one, free cash flow. To determine the free cash flow, we take the net cash flow from operating activities and adjust it with the purchase done towards assets. So once we do that calculation, we get these values. We had already calculated these values in the previous videos. So I have taken these values from our cash flow sheet. I just directly put an equal to formula and looked up all these values and then divided it by 100 because these values here are in lakhs and we want to use a common unit, that is crores. So now that we get our values in crores, this is the amount in crores highlighted in blue. Now that we know our step one of free cash flow, let us see how to determine the future projected cash flow. For this, we take our net income. So net income comes from the P&L. So the P&L, which is row number 22, consolidated profit after tax. These are the values which we fetch into our DCF. So we populate all the historical values of net income of the company by looking up into the values of P&L. Once we have our net income, we already know the free cash flow. We refer these values from the previous step. Once we refer these values, we determine the ratio. That is, we basically divide these two values. We take free cash flow divided by net income. And once we get these values, I have already calculated the values. So this is a percentage of free cash flow over the net income. And then we derive the average ratio, which is 100.4%. Now that we know our ratio of free cash flow versus the net income, what we do is we project the net income based on the CAGR of the net income itself. Now we see here the CAGR of net income is lesser than the CAGR of free cash flow. So to be conservative, we pick up the CAGR of net income and we project all the values of net income based on 9.5%. So once we project our net income, we then use the ratio, that is our free cash flow by net income, which is 100.4%. We refer this value as you see here, N29. This is N, column N29. So once we take this values into each and every year of projected free cash flow, we determine the free cash flow by multiplying the net income with the ratio. So we take G27 and then multiply it by G29. So once we do this, we get our projected free cash flow. Now that we have a projected free cash flow, we can populate into our formula. So we know the actual free cash flow and we also know our projected free cash flow. We don't know yet our terminal value of the free cash flow. So for that, we will come to that. Our step 3 is to determine the required growth rate. By using the WACC model, we arrive to the growth rate as 7.07%. However, in this video, I'll be using the cost of capital, which is 15%. In my next subsequent video, I will show you how to use the WACC model to arrive to the required growth rate of the company. And the WACC model is more realistic because different companies have different cost of capital depending on the competitive edge of the company, its bargaining power, the negotiation power with the banks and institutions. So let's go to our step 4. Step 4 is a perpetual growth rate, which we have already identified by taking the GDP growth rate of all the 30 years and then averaging it out, which we get it at 5.2%. And then we move on to step 5, which is our terminal value calculation. Here we take the last year's free cash flow, and the last year's free cash flow is 1704. Multiply that with the perpetual growth rate, 1 plus perpetual growth rate. Perpetual growth rate is 5.2%, and then divide it by the required return. In our case, required return is our cost of capital, and then subtract it with the perpetual growth rate, which is again 5.2%. So this is what we see here as the calculation. And this is the value which we get as our terminal value of the company. Let me demonstrate once. The free cash flow, we look it up here. Then we multiply that with 1 plus the perpetual growth rate, which is 5.2%. And then divided that required growth rate, which is 15%, we'll just directly populate it here, minus the perpetual growth rate. So we get a different value. The reason is because in the previous calculation, we had used the WACC model of the required growth rate. So what I will do is, I will change this to 7.07, which will give us the almost the same value. So in fact, I would directly look up the required growth rate, which is from here. Sorry. We take this value from here, and we get exactly the same value based on 7.07. In our illustration, let us assume 7.07 itself for simplicity. And we can also see based on the cost of capital as well. We can see both the ways. But only the steps of WACC that I will demonstrate in the separate video. So now that we know our terminal value, we go and populate our terminal value into our model. So here comes our terminal value. Now the discount factor, we already know the formula. 1, here is the formula, 1 plus C4. C4 is our required rate of return, required growth based on the WACC model. I have highlighted here. I have taken it, okay, 15%. We can also check it out with 7.07 as well later on. For now, let us use 15%. So based on 15%, based on 15%, let us calculate our discounted rate. So these are the values which I highlighted here. These are the discounted rates to be used. So 1 plus C4 raised to the power of the year. So because the first projected year is going to be 1, for the subsequent projected year is going to be 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then for the terminal value, we are going to use the same value as the last projected year. And once we have this, we divide the future cash flow with the discount factor to get the present value of all the free cash flows. So now that we have arrived to the present value of all the free cash flows, let us now sum it all up. And the summation of all these values, as you see here, it's all summed up from the row of present value to derive the intrinsic value of the company. And then we divide the intrinsic value of the company with the shares outstanding of the company. So this will give us the fair value of the company, which is 2167.45. And if we apply the margin of safety, which is 20%, we get our price to buy as 1,733. So please don't go ahead and start buying Colgate-Palmolive. There is a set of steps or set of approach which we need to use in order to buy a specific company. This is only for illustration purpose. So please bear in mind, this is only for illustration. So now let us see quick our cost of capital, that is our WACC. Let us keep it same as 7.07. And if we use 7.07, then we have to also Right. This is already considering 7.07. So by considering 7.07, this is the fair value of the company, 2861, and the adjusted value is 2289. So if we consider 15%, let us relook at 15%, because earlier we had considered the terminal value by using 7% and the cost of capital as 15%. That was a different. So if we use 15% here, then we need to use 15% here as well in our terminal value. So we take, instead of 7.7, we take 15%. This is our terminal value. With this, the fair value of the company comes like 565 rupees. So this is just an illustration, by the way. So you can choose the cost of capital. The WACC model is more accurate, as I would say. So let me put back the WACC model of the formula. 7%. Then we use 7% here as well, which is our cost of capital using WACC. With this, we get the value as 2289. So with this, we conclude our demonstration for calculating the fair price of the company by using the discounted cash flow model of the in fact. So our next video, which I'm going to showcase to you, is going to be the Buffett value of arriving into the valuation of the company. The Buffett method is much more simpler. It is much more easy to understand, and it is my preferred method as well, which I use to evaluate most of the company. I've in fact evaluated more than 50 companies by using the Buffett method of valuation. So let us go into our next illustration. Please subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe so that you can watch my next valuation method, which is the Buffett valuation. So see you until then.